James Harris blinked slowly, fighting to clear his blurred vision as a dull, throbbing ache pulsed relentlessly behind his temples, each heartbeat echoing the violence he had just survived, the bitter taste of blood still lingering on his cracked lips, mixing with sweat and earth, a brutal reminder of betrayal. Slowly he pushed himself onto one elbow, feeling a sharp pain slicing through his bruised ribs, muscles protesting violently as the echoes of harsh blows delivered by ruthless fists resurfaced vividly, but James ignored the agony, driven solely by a force stronger than pain, a burning need to reclaim what was stolen. The dense forest around him pressed in like a suffocating embrace, shadows wrapping his bruised, dark skin in a protective cloak of invisibility, a subtle advantage he'd mastered years before, surviving missions deep behind enemy lines, where being unseen meant the difference between life and death. Stumbling forward, his heavy boots scraping against tangled roots, James moved toward a distant roadway, his thoughts consumed by memories of his beloved aircraft, the sleek metal machine he'd meticulously maintained, symbolizing his hard-earned freedom after leaving the service, now ripped away by ruthless smugglers who had mistaken him for easy prey. The image of Richard Cole's arrogant smile, illuminated briefly by the cockpit's dim light, haunted James, fueling a simmering rage he could barely contain, his mind replaying Cole's cold voice ordering his men to discard James like worthless garbage, underestimating the resilience and determination that had always defined him. Finally reaching the roadside, James steadied himself, leaning against a splintered wooden signpost, feeling the rough texture beneath his calloused fingers, each breath coming in labored gasps as headlights approached through the dense fog, slicing the darkness like a lifeline. Raising a trembling hand, he signaled desperately, relief flooding his weary body as the battered truck slowed cautiously to a halt, its engine rumbling softly like distant thunder, the driver's cautious eyes scrutinizing James through a grimy windshield before unlocking the passenger door with a reluctant nod, sensing an urgent need in the battered man standing resolutely before him. James climbed painfully into the vehicle, sinking heavily onto the torn vinyl seat, inhaling deeply the scent of stale tobacco mixed with gasoline, the familiar smells grounding him momentarily, allowing him to regain his composure as the older driver watched him with quiet curiosity, unspoken questions lingering in the confined space between them. "You all right there, friend?" the driver's gravelly voice asked hesitantly, breaking the heavy silence, genuine concern reflected briefly in his tired eyes, scanning the visible bruises and cuts that marred James's weary face, though James merely managed a tight, humorless smile, responding curtly, "I've had worse," hiding the true depth of his physical agony and the tumultuous storm raging beneath his calm exterior. Accepting the driver's offered phone with a quiet nod of gratitude, James quickly dialed Tamara Bennett's familiar number, his loyal mechanic and trusted friend, a woman whose steady hands and sharp intellect had always kept him flying safely, her concerned voice cutting sharply through the static-filled connection, instantly sensing trouble from his strained breathing. "James, what happened?" she demanded urgently, worry woven tightly into every syllable, her voice a reassuring anchor amid the swirling chaos of his thoughts, and James answered tersely, "Cole's gang hijacked the plane, left me for dead," his words thick with suppressed anger, each syllable dripping venom, prompting a tense silence on the other end before Tamara spoke again firmly, unwavering in determination. "Tell me what you need," offering steadfast support without hesitation. As the truck rattled onward through winding country roads, James laid his head briefly against the cold window, eyes focused intently into the oppressive darkness outside, determination coalescing within his battered body, transforming the crushing defeat into unyielding resolve, already planning how he'd strike back, reclaim his aircraft, dismantle Cole's operation, and teach them all a harsh lesson in underestimating a man forged by fire, who had survived battles far worse than the one they'd foolishly ignited tonight, a man who would never yield again. When the battered truck finally rattled to a halt outside Tamara's dimly lit garage on the outskirts of town, James felt a surge of relief course through his aching body, the sight of the familiar, oil-stained building reigniting his fading hope, a beacon promising safety and solidarity amid the chaos. Tamara Bennett emerged quickly from the shadowed doorway, her face tense with worry and determination, eyes narrowing sharply as she took in James's battered appearance, swiftly moving toward him without hesitation, guiding him inside with a firm yet gentle hand, every touch radiating warmth and compassion he desperately needed but couldn't ask for. Inside the cluttered garage, the scent of engine grease and gasoline filled James's lungs, the familiar aroma comforting him, anchoring his frayed nerves as he sank gratefully into an old chair, exhaling heavily as Tamara quietly examined his injuries with practiced precision, her slender, capable fingers carefully cleaning his wounds, silently piecing together the brutality he'd endured without forcing explanations or unnecessary questions, knowing his pride wouldn't allow him to voice the full extent of his pain aloud. James watched her work, noting the calm intensity of her expression, reminded again why he trusted her implicitly. Tamara was more than just his mechanic. She was a trusted partner who'd stood beside him through countless struggles, each shared crisis strengthening their unspoken bond, forged by mutual respect and quiet understanding rather than empty promises or hollow words. After his wounds were treated and exhaustion began retreating slowly, replaced by simmering rage and determination, James shared his plan to reclaim the stolen plane, his voice quiet yet firm, outlining his intention to track down the smugglers who had ruthlessly targeted him, knowing deep down they were just one small piece of a larger, more sinister operation, a threat he couldn't ignore or allow to flourish unchecked. Tamara listened silently, her gaze unwavering, absorbing every detail he revealed, her mind quickly analyzing potential obstacles and vulnerabilities in his hastily formed strategy, recognizing immediately the necessity of obtaining accurate intelligence about Cole's dangerous organization to avoid catastrophic mistakes or deadly surprises. Understanding they lacked crucial information, James reached out cautiously to Lenny Foster, a former customs agent whose career ended prematurely after a dangerous bust went disastrously wrong, yet whose connections within the shadowy underworld remained intact, offering a lifeline James desperately needed to locate his hijacked plane swiftly and precisely before Cole vanished into darkness forever. Lenny reluctantly agreed to meet at a quiet diner across town, his weathered face etched deeply by years of regret and distrust, eyes narrowing skeptically as James explained his desperate situation, yet gradually softening as he recognized the familiar pain of betrayal reflected clearly in James's exhausted eyes, knowing intimately how easily the past could resurface violently and mercilessly. Lenny disclosed quietly that Cole's operation was larger and deadlier than most realized, revealing the aircraft had been moved swiftly to an abandoned airstrip hidden among dense woodland, a place so remote only seasoned smugglers dared operate openly, loading weapons bound for violent gangs who profited from chaos and destruction, every shipment fueling tragedy James refused to allow. Armed with Lenny's crucial information, James returned swiftly to the garage, determined to infiltrate Cole's heavily guarded compound disguised convincingly as a prospective client seeking discreet transportation, a dangerous gamble risking exposure and certain death, yet the only viable option he possessed to recover his stolen plane and confront Cole directly, ending his violent enterprise permanently. Tamara immediately voiced deep concerns, her usually steady voice wavering slightly with anxiety, insisting quietly that James risked recognition, emphasizing how easily Cole's ruthless men might recall the pilot they'd beaten mercilessly just days before, exposing him instantly, resulting inevitably in deadly consequences neither could reverse or escape once triggered. Despite her warnings, James remained resolute, driven by unyielding anger and pride, unwilling to abandon his plan regardless of personal danger, convinced his skill and nerve would carry him safely through perilous deception, determined Cole's arrogance and greed would ultimately blind him to the vengeful force preparing silently, patiently, to dismantle his empire from within. Under the name Jason Lewis, James Harris strode confidently into the dark heart of Cole's criminal world, feeling every nerve in his body tighten with tension, yet outwardly projecting calm authority, a performance meticulously crafted to deceive the ruthless men who controlled the shadowy compound. The abandoned airfield stretched silently around him, rusted metal hangars looming menacingly, their jagged silhouettes cutting sharply against a bleak sky, echoing memories of similar desolate landscapes he'd known intimately during dangerous missions overseas, where death lurked invisibly behind every rusted door and cracked windowpane. Standing defiantly beside the largest hanger was Donovan Wright, Cole's volatile lieutenant, whose muscular arms were crossed aggressively over his broad chest, dark eyes glinting suspiciously beneath the brim of his faded baseball cap, scrutinizing James with undisguised hostility and barely contained aggression, clearly displeased at the intrusion of an unknown newcomer into his tightly controlled operations. Donovan's penetrating gaze bored deeply into James, searching relentlessly for cracks in the carefully constructed facade James maintained, as he offered a firm handshake, his grip intentionally strong to convey confidence, yet subtly respectful enough not to provoke immediate conflict, silently hoping Donovan wouldn't recognize the battered face they'd left behind in the forest days before. A tense moment lingered heavily between them as Donovan's brows knitted in confusion, suspicion flickering briefly in his hard eyes, recognizing something vaguely familiar in James's composed expression, but the memory remained elusive, frustrating Donovan visibly, making his jaw tighten angrily before he reluctantly released James's hand and stepped backward slightly, his gaze still wary, indicating clearly that James had only narrowly avoided exposure in this initial dangerous encounter. As James carefully explained his fabricated background and intentions, weaving effortlessly convincing lies about seeking reliable transportation for delicate cargo requiring absolute discretion, Donovan listened carefully, skepticism evident in his guarded stance, his body language betraying lingering doubts about James's authenticity. Instincts honed sharply through years spent dealing intimately with ruthless criminals, traitors, and spies, all capable of deceiving convincingly without betraying their true agendas. Nevertheless, Donovan gradually seemed persuaded enough by James's calm demeanor and detailed knowledge of aircraft operations to cautiously proceed, motioning James deeper into the hangar, allowing him brief glimpses of stacked wooden crates marked discreetly with cryptic symbols, partially concealed by tarps, each clearly containing weapons destined for ruthless hands intent on unleashing terror and chaos upon innocent lives. James's heart constricted painfully as realization hit with devastating clarity. Cole's sinister operation extended far beyond simple smuggling. The lethal arsenal stored here would soon arm a radical group capable of unimaginable violence, threatening countless innocents, forcing James to acknowledge that reclaiming his stolen plane had now become secondary to preventing a horrific tragedy he could never allow to unfold. Donovan casually mentioned that these deadly shipments demanded pilots of absolute trustworthiness, announcing coldly that James would undergo an immediate test flight, a mandatory demonstration designed explicitly to verify both his competence and reliability before any significant transaction would even be considered, his tone leaving no doubt that failure, hesitation, or weakness would result swiftly and mercilessly in death, leaving no room for error or second chances. James nodded confidently, masking his inner turmoil with practiced ease, understanding instinctively that Donovan's proposed test flight represented far more than simple verification of piloting skills. It was a ruthless examination of character, resolve, and courage, a deadly trial intended explicitly to reveal any hidden agenda or deception, pushing James's resilience dangerously close to breaking point, yet also offering the crucial opportunity he desperately needed to infiltrate deeper, sabotage Cole's operation, and ultimately prevent impending disaster. As James moved purposefully toward the waiting aircraft, preparing mentally and emotionally for the imminent, perilous flight under Donovan's watchful, hostile gaze, he felt cold determination solidifying powerfully within him, understanding clearly that surviving this brutal test marked only the beginning of a far more dangerous journey ahead, one demanding every ounce of strength, cunning, and bravery he possessed, testing him repeatedly and relentlessly, each challenge more deadly and treacherous than the last, pushing him ever closer to either ultimate triumph or absolute destruction. James eased himself into the cockpit of the unfamiliar plane, feeling an unsettling tension coil tightly within him as Donovan Wright settled menacingly into the seat beside him, eyes coldly focused, one hand openly gripping a pistol resting provocatively across his thigh, a blatant threat meant to ensure absolute obedience during this critical test flight. Adjusting the controls methodically, James swiftly evaluated the layout, mentally absorbing every unfamiliar instrument with practiced efficiency, silently reminding himself this was no different from the countless high-pressure missions he'd executed flawlessly before, though the hostile gaze burning relentlessly into the side of his face sent icy tendrils of dread down his spine, reinforcing the grim reality that a single misstep could cost him everything. The engines roared aggressively to life as he pushed forward on the throttle, vibrations coursing through his fingertips like raw electricity, the aircraft surging powerfully along the crude, makeshift runway, wheels jolting violently against uneven terrain before smoothly lifting free, finally carrying them swiftly upward into turbulent skies filled with uncertainty and concealed danger. Donovan remained silently watchful until they reached cruising altitude, his muscular frame deceptively relaxed, dark eyes glittering ominously, studying James intently, searching for signs of weakness or hesitation he could exploit, deliberately prolonging an oppressive silence designed strategically to unnerve and destabilize the unfamiliar pilot seated rigidly beside him, testing his resolve in subtle, sinister ways. Finally breaking the tense silence, Donovan's voice sliced sharply through the roar of engines, asking unexpected questions about past operations, probing aggressively into fabricated details of James's supposed criminal history, each inquiry carefully crafted to trap or confuse him, seeking inconsistencies that would justify immediate suspicion and lethal action. Donovan's fingers tightening noticeably around the gun with every unsatisfactory answer, amplifying the intensity of his scrutiny and heightening the perilous stakes of this volatile airborne interrogation. James responded calmly, precisely maintaining his fictional identity, never betraying the inner turmoil churning violently within, his voice steady and confident, every response meticulously prepared to withstand intense scrutiny, yet aware Donovan's probing questions were gradually narrowing dangerously close to exposing contradictions, forcing James to constantly adapt, refine, and perfect his deception mid-flight, aware that his performance was the razor-thin barrier separating survival from oblivion. Donovan suddenly leaned forward, voice dropping into a menacing whisper, weapon shifting deliberately closer, openly threatening that if James harbored any hidden motives or betrayal, his life would end swiftly here at 20,000 feet, his body never found, words chillingly direct, intended explicitly to provoke panic or confession. Yet James held Donovan's gaze unwaveringly, refusing to reveal the slightest crack in his carefully controlled facade, understanding instinctively that showing weakness now meant inevitable failure and death. Impressed grudgingly by James's remarkable composure under extreme duress, Donovan finally relaxed marginally, reluctantly withdrawing the weapon slightly, grudgingly convinced, for now, that James possessed sufficient courage, skill, and ruthlessness necessary for partnership within Cole's dangerous enterprise, yet inwardly determined to monitor James relentlessly, privately ordering trusted subordinates to follow every step James took, observing closely for even subtle signs of duplicity, believing deeply that sooner or later, James's carefully constructed identity would fracture spectacularly under relentless pressure, exposing hidden truths Donovan instinctively sensed lurking beneath his polished surface. Landing smoothly back at the hidden airstrip, James exhaled slowly, feeling exhausted relief flood his tense muscles, understanding clearly he'd narrowly survived the treacherous ordeal designed specifically to break weaker men, grateful his nerves and experience had not betrayed him, though keenly aware Donovan's lingering suspicions ensured future tests and dangers would escalate dramatically in severity, relentlessly pushing him closer to deadly exposure unless he acted decisively and quickly. Returning swiftly to Tamara's workshop, James quietly revealed the grim reality of Donovan's suspicions, warning urgently they'd likely already become targets of discreet surveillance, cautioning her to expect increased scrutiny and risk, advising immediate vigilance to prevent dangerous mistakes capable of unraveling their fragile plans entirely, knowing precisely how deadly Donovan's paranoia would become if allowed to spiral unchecked. Tamara absorbed the sobering news gravely, acknowledging James's stark warning with quiet, unwavering resolve, determination clearly reflected in her intense gaze, silently preparing herself mentally and emotionally for looming challenges ahead, understanding deeply that success now demanded flawless precision, impeccable planning, and absolute secrecy, Knowing one small misstep would unleash catastrophic consequences neither could reverse nor escape, permanently sealing their fates amid darkness and violence. Donovan stepped into the dimly lit diner, the stale scent of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke mingling thickly in the cramped space, as he sought temporary refuge from the stress of constant vigilance. His eyes casually swept across patrons, landing unexpectedly upon Lenny Foster, the disgraced former customs agent seated alone in a corner booth, nursing a half-empty cup of coffee and looking worn down by past mistakes and heavy regrets. Suspicion flared instinctively within Donovan as he approached, his memory stirring uneasily with flickers of recognition, prompting him to confront Lenny with thinly disguised hostility, demanding sharply to know what business had drawn the fallen agent back into town, a demand Lenny met with weary silence, avoiding Donovan's aggressive stare until threats forced reluctant answers, words that inadvertently confirmed Donovan's worst suspicions, shattering James's carefully constructed false identity. Lenny, caught off guard and terrified, desperately revealed details Donovan quickly pieced together. Jason Lewis was a fiction. James Harris, a betrayed pilot thought dead, had survived and infiltrated Cole's operation under false pretenses, igniting a furious rage within Donovan who felt humiliated and outsmarted, vowing immediate revenge against the imposter who'd deceived them all. Across town, unaware of impending danger, James stood inside Tamara's cluttered garage, senses alert yet unable to anticipate the explosive chaos rapidly descending upon them. As he finalized plans for their next crucial move, the sudden screeching of tires and slamming car doors shattered the fragile peace, forcing adrenaline sharply through his veins, his heart pounding violently as realization dawned grimly. They had been discovered. The door burst violently open, revealing Donovan's men storming aggressively into the garage, weapons drawn and expressions coldly merciless, leaving James mere seconds to react instinctively, grabbing a heavy wrench from the cluttered workbench and throwing himself protectively between the attackers and Tamara, determination and desperation intertwining fiercely in every frantic heartbeat. Chaos erupted instantly, the small space becoming a brutal battlefield as James fought desperately against overwhelming odds, driven by survival instincts honed sharply from years of dangerous military missions, each calculated strike landing with ruthless precision, fueled by panic and unyielding resolve. Despite exhaustion and lingering injuries, he managed to hold the attackers at bay momentarily, hoping desperately to provide Tamara an opportunity to escape unharmed. Amidst the violent confusion, however, a shot rang sharply through the confined space, a single deafening blast that sliced through James's focus, instantly followed by Tamara's pained cry, a sound that tore mercilessly through him, freezing his heart in horror and guilt as he turned sharply, witnessing her collapse against a battered toolbox, blood blossoming vividly upon her arm, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Rage surged uncontrollably within James, an overpowering wave of guilt and fury blending into a singular, unstoppable force, driving him to strike with renewed, unrestrained ferocity, each blow now exacting vengeance for Tamara's injury, every movement guided by an overwhelming desire to punish those responsible for harming the one person who had selflessly risked everything to help him. Finally overpowering their assailants long enough to seize a narrow escape, James swiftly guided Tamara from the garage, supporting her trembling, injured body as they staggered painfully through shadowed alleyways and empty streets, each step burdened heavily by fear, exhaustion, and growing desperation, their narrow survival balanced precariously upon fragile moments of luck and rapidly dwindling strength. Finding temporary safety within a deserted storage unit hidden among abandoned warehouses, James quickly attended to Tamara's injury, hands trembling with barely contained anguish as guilt clawed relentlessly at him, vividly aware it was his dangerous quest for revenge that had directly caused her suffering, deepening the wound within his heart far beyond any physical pain either had endured. Watching her pale, brave face twist in quiet agony, James finally accepted the harsh truth he'd resisted fiercely until now. There was no turning back or further hesitation allowed. Decisive action was imperative, the stakes now too personal, too raw to ignore, his mind crystallizing sharply with ruthless clarity around a single unwavering thought. He would end this deadly game immediately, permanently dismantling Cole's violent empire, protecting Tamara and countless innocent lives, no matter the personal cost demanded. Hidden within a secluded, shadow-drenched clearing near the abandoned airfield, James Harris carefully unfolded the map, his fingers trembling slightly with urgency, determination etched deeply into his features as he traced the perimeter of dense forest, mentally charting a perilous route toward the heart of Cole's heavily guarded compound. Every muscle in his body coiled tightly, adrenaline surging fiercely, heart hammering in steady rhythm, reminiscent of countless dangerous night operations he had executed flawlessly during his years in the Air Force. Knowing this plan left no room for hesitation or error, each second holding the power of life or violent death. With practiced stealth, he quickly packed a compact bag containing explosives, tools, and essential survival gear, securing each item methodically, reminding himself silently that precision and timing would dictate survival tonight, an uncompromising reality that sharpened his focus with every deliberate movement. Slipping soundlessly through the tangled undergrowth, the heavy darkness pressed oppressively around him, branches scraping roughly against his fatigued body, the scent of damp earth and pine resin filling his senses, every nerve taut, aware that unseen sentries patrolled the area relentlessly, trained to shoot intruders on sight. Drawing upon skills honed under fire, James meticulously navigated the labyrinthine woodland, each calculated step moving him closer to his target, the vulnerable fuel depot located at the compound's northern edge, its volatile contents crucial to executing the diversion necessary for his audacious infiltration. Reaching the perimeter unnoticed, James crouched low near rusted barrels filled with highly flammable aviation fuel, his hands expertly rigging explosive charges with quiet, confident efficiency, understanding vividly that his life depended entirely upon creating maximum panic among Cole's ruthless followers. Once the final wire connected, he retreated silently into shadowy safety, inhaling deeply, steadying his nerves, before pressing the small detonator tightly within his grasp, activating a fierce explosion that ruptured the peaceful night violently, flames erupting dramatically skyward, casting sinister, flickering shadows across the airfield. Chaos erupted immediately throughout the compound, shouts of alarm punctuating the roar of burning fuel, men rushing desperately toward the fire in disorganized panic, temporarily abandoning their defensive posts, providing James precisely the opportunity he'd hoped for, his pulse quickening sharply with exhilaration and fear intertwined. Moving swiftly, he darted unseen through swirling smoke and confusion toward the distant hangar, heart nearly stopping as he glimpsed his beloved aircraft positioned prominently, its cargo bay doors wide open, crates of deadly weapons neatly stacked inside, evidence confirming Cole's malicious intent to unleash devastating violence upon innocent lives. Painful urgency surged fiercely within James, compelling him onward, determination driving every step, until suddenly Donovan emerged threateningly from shadowed obscurity, eyes glinting murderously, pistol leveled steadily, aimed directly at James's heart, his sneer conveying pure hatred and triumphant satisfaction at finally confronting the impostor who had dared infiltrate their brutal enterprise. Instinctively, James lunged forward, instantly closing distance, knocking the firearm aside just as Donovan fired, the deafening shot echoing sharply, sending bullets ricocheting dangerously nearby, intensifying their deadly confrontation, both men wrestling savagely, desperate to seize control in a primal struggle driven by bitter enmity and survival instincts. Donovan's powerful fists struck repeatedly, each punishing blow intended to break James physically and mentally, yet fueled by unwavering resolve and fierce determination, James absorbed the punishment, retaliating viciously with calculated precision, refusing utterly to yield ground despite overwhelming pain. Finally, seizing a fleeting advantage, James delivered a brutal strike, rendering Donovan unconscious, his body collapsing heavily onto the cold tarmac, momentarily neutralized but undeniably alive, leaving James grimly aware that Cole himself remained free, dangerous and vengeful, a sinister presence watching silently from hidden vantage points nearby. Breathing heavily, James turned toward his stolen aircraft, knowing this victory represented merely one crucial battle amid ongoing war, deeply conscious that Cole would inevitably retaliate, his ruthless promise of vengeance reverberating ominously through James's exhausted mind, reinforcing the stark truth that final confrontation loomed inevitably ahead, promising violent resolution neither could avoid. James pushed the throttles forward, engines roaring defiantly as his stolen plane surged down the rough airstrip, its tires jolting violently over uneven ground, every vibration sending sharp jolts of anxiety through his tense muscles, his pulse accelerating rapidly with the grim realization that this escape would be far from smooth. As the wheels finally lifted off, leaving solid earth beneath them, a harsh alarm blared abruptly in the cockpit, flashing urgently, signaling dangerously low fuel levels, a dire warning James instantly recognized as sabotage, betrayal slicing deeply through his chest with painful certainty that Tamara had deliberately compromised their plan, hoping desperately to prevent him from risking his life further, yet inadvertently plunging him into greater peril. Glancing quickly at fuel indicators descending rapidly toward empty, James grimly assessed limited options, knowing immediately he lacked sufficient reserves to reach a safe landing site, forced instead toward a deadly gamble, maneuvering dangerously through rugged canyon terrain he remembered from earlier missions, a landscape he'd previously navigated expertly, though never under such treacherous circumstances. His battered plane now crippled by betrayal, chased relentlessly by Cole's ruthless enforcers who tore viciously across dusty roads below, determined to exact lethal vengeance. With fierce determination, James angled the struggling aircraft toward towering cliffs ahead, eyes narrowing sharply, every muscle rigid with concentration, prepared instinctively for imminent combat flying, heart pounding fiercely against his ribcage as bullets suddenly pierced the tense silence, fired recklessly from vehicles speeding beneath him, each projectile missing narrowly, adrenaline surging wildly through his veins with each deafening ricochet echoing sharply within confined canyon. Forced into extreme evasive maneuvers, James expertly banked sharply left and right, skimming perilously close to jagged rocks, his skilled hands gripping controls tightly, exerting precise authority despite mounting panic, aware every small miscalculation could instantly become fatal, silently cursing Tamara's misguided intervention that now placed him in desperate danger, his mind struggling to suppress haunting thoughts questioning her trustworthiness, distracting doubts threatening to undermine his crucial focus. Suddenly spotting a narrow gap between sheer cliffs ahead, James swiftly angled downward, plunging fearlessly through the slim opening at breakneck speed, his plane narrowly evading crushing impact, turbulence buffeting the craft violently, structural integrity strained dangerously under extreme stress. Below, frantic pursuit continued recklessly, Cole's enraged men determinately following James's hazardous path, their vehicle barreling precariously around sharp turns, until inevitably losing control completely, tumbling spectacularly off the rugged roadway, exploding violently against rocks far below, fiery wreckage scattering chaotically. Yet amid swirling dust and flames, Cole miraculously emerged, staggering painfully from smoldering debris, battered but alive, his cold eyes burning murderously skyward, silently promising merciless vengeance against James, hatred strengthening his resolve beyond injury or fear. Barely managing to glide the crippled plane to relative safety, James landed roughly near Tamara's hidden refuge, emotions colliding violently within him as he confronted her immediately, voice strained, desperately demanding explanations for sabotage he'd narrowly survived. Eyes glistening with barely restrained tears, Tamara confessed painfully, admitting unbearable fear of losing him forever. Her misguided attempt at protection motivated purely by profound love, anguish etched deeply across her bruised face, visibly weakened from her earlier injuries, yet fiercely defiant, determinately challenging James's relentless quest for retribution, pleading urgently for caution, patience, reconsideration. Feeling guilt and uncertainty overwhelm him entirely, James's hardened exterior cracked visibly, anguished vulnerability revealing itself openly, confessing earnestly how deeply fear of losing Tamara now paralyzed him with doubt. His fight no longer merely about reclaiming his stolen aircraft, but fundamentally about preserving fragile bonds they'd forged amid relentless danger. Terrified his single-minded pursuit threatened to destroy everything truly valuable to him, leaving only emptiness. Regret, irreparable loss. Tamara stepped closer, gently taking his trembling hands firmly into hers, eyes blazing passionately with unyielding conviction, reminding James fiercely that their struggle had never been merely about personal revenge or lost possessions, but about confronting profound injustice, preventing terrible tragedy, protecting countless innocent lives from ruthless exploitation, affirming resolutely that even personal sacrifices were necessary burdens carried by those who stood bravely against darkness, her unwavering voice reigniting courage and purpose deeply within James's wounded heart. Nodding slowly, James felt clarity returning sharply, her steadfast belief cutting powerfully through lingering confusion and guilt, reawakening his fierce determination to finish what had begun, knowing now he could not falter or hesitate further, fully prepared to face Cole's inevitable retaliation head-on, fighting relentlessly until justice triumphed decisively, whatever heavy price victory ultimately demanded from both their hearts. The night shattered with the screech of tires as Cole's convoy of blacked-out SUVs surrounded Tamara's garage, their high beams flooding the area with a blinding glare that turned the space into an inescapable trap. The metallic snap of gun safeties being disengaged cut through the tense silence, followed by the heavy stomp of boots as Cole's men advanced with the precision of seasoned hunters. Tamara barely had time to react, her fingers inching toward the pistol hidden beneath the workbench, but the door exploded inward before she could reach it, splinters flying in all directions as Cole strode in, his cold, predatory gaze locking onto her like a viper ready to strike. The moment she lunged for the weapon, his hand clamped down on her wrist with crushing force, yanking her forward, his grip like iron as he twisted her arm behind her back, making her gasp in pain. "Now we see just how much he values you," Cole murmured against her ear, pressing the cold steel of his gun to her temple, relishing the sharp rise and fall of her chest as she struggled against him, her eyes burning with defiance despite the fear coursing through her veins. Miles away, James drove like a man possessed, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, every breath sharp and shallow as he processed the grim reality that had just unfolded. Cole had Tamara, and that meant there was no negotiation, no second chances. This was the endgame. His foot pressed harder against the gas pedal, the city lights blurring past him in streaks of gold and red, his mind a battlefield of strategy and raw, unfiltered rage. He had known this fight was coming, but now, with Tamara's life hanging in the balance, hesitation was no longer an option. By the time he reached the garage, every muscle in his body was coiled with tension, his heart hammering in his chest as he threw the car into park and stepped out, immediately met with the sight of Cole standing in the open, Tamara locked tightly in his grip, the muzzle of his gun still resting against her head. "You came alone," Cole observed, a slow smirk curling his lips, his grip tightening on Tamara as if to test James's resolve. "Not as smart as I thought." James's hands clenched into fists, his mind scanning every possible move, but one thing was clear, this wasn't going to end in a negotiation. "Let her go," he demanded, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Cole chuckled, the sound low and taunting. "Not until we settle this properly," he said, shoving Tamara roughly toward one of his men, who held her in place while keeping a gun trained on her. "You and me. No weapons. Just fists." James exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, his body already bracing for the inevitable. "Fine." The second he stepped forward, Cole launched at him like a battering ram, their bodies colliding in a brutal tangle of fists and rage. The impact sent James staggering back, but he recovered quickly, dodging Cole's next strike and delivering a crushing blow to his ribs. Cole grunted but retaliated instantly, driving his knee into James's gut, knocking the wind out of him before slamming a fist into his jaw. Pain exploded through James's skull, but he refused to go down, his body moving on instinct, years of combat experience fueling every counterstrike. They fought like men who had nothing left to lose, every punch thrown with deadly intent, every impact reverberating through their bones like a war drum. Through the haze of pain, James caught a glimpse of Tamara struggling against her captor, her foot striking out in a desperate attempt to free herself. The distraction cost him. Cole capitalized on the momentary lapse, slamming James hard against the hood of a car, his fingers closing around James's throat, squeezing with relentless force. Darkness crept into the edges of James's vision, but the sound of Tamara's pained gasp cut through the haze, reigniting the fire inside him. Summoning every ounce of strength, he drove his elbow into Cole's side, breaking the hold before launching a devastating uppercut that sent Cole reeling. Seizing the moment, James tackled him to the ground, pinning him down with an unforgiving grip before landing a series of brutal blows, his knuckles splitting against Cole's skin. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, not until he knew the threat was gone for good. The wail of approaching sirens barely registered in his mind as he straddled Cole's battered form, his breath ragged, his vision blurred with exhaustion and fury. Police stormed the area, weapons drawn, shouting commands as they swarmed the scene. James forced himself to his feet, stepping back as officers pulled Cole's barely conscious body off the pavement, slapping cuffs onto his bloodied wrists. It was over. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But as he turned, seeing Tamara clutching her wounded arm, pain flickering in her eyes, he felt no relief, only the crushing weight of everything it had cost them. Victory had come, but at a price he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. In the aftermath, James found himself adrift within a storm of emotions he thought he had long buried, his mind tortured by relentless echoes of violence that drew him back into a shadowed past he'd fought desperately to escape, a past he believed had finally relinquished its grip only to return now with merciless intensity, dragging him deeper into darkness. Each moment alone became an endless loop of painful memories, his body still aching from fresh bruises and battered bones, constant reminders of the brutal confrontation with Cole, yet these physical injuries paled in comparison to the wounds inflicted upon his spirit, deeper scars that would take much longer to heal, if ever. His nights were sleepless, haunted by images of blood and fury, eyes hollow with regret, heart heavy with an overwhelming guilt for the suffering he inadvertently brought upon those closest to him, particularly Tamara, whose resilience had been severely tested and whose recovery now occupied every waking thought he possessed. Though Tamara was healing, her physical injuries slowly mending with careful medical attention, the damage ran far deeper beneath her skin, leaving permanent reminders etched within her soul, shadows in her eyes reflecting pain that James could neither erase nor fully comprehend, despite his desperate longing to do so. The weight of responsibility pressed relentlessly upon him, a suffocating burden that gnawed incessantly at his resolve, leaving him questioning every choice he'd ever made, every fight he'd ever chosen to pursue, wondering bitterly if justice was truly achievable through such unrelenting brutality, or whether he'd merely perpetuated an endless cycle of loss. Driven by an overwhelming need to sever his connection to recent horrors, James resolved to sell the plane, once a symbol of freedom and achievement but now irrevocably tarnished, forever tainted by memories of violence and betrayal, transformed into a painful reminder of every sacrifice he had endured, every innocence lost. The mere sight of it filled him with profound sorrow, its gleaming fuselage now a monument to shattered dreams rather than soaring triumph. It was amid this dark introspection that Lenny Foster arrived, unexpectedly seeking out James with characteristic bluntness, his gruff voice cutting through James's hesitation like sharpened steel, confronting him boldly and unflinchingly, his piercing gaze filled with relentless determination, unwavering in the face of James's evident despair, challenging him directly with words that resonated deep within his wounded soul. Walking away now, Lenny declared sternly, each syllable landing with forceful clarity, is letting Cole win permanently, handing victory to every corrupt force you've ever stood against, surrendering everything you've ever fought for, the words stinging harshly yet carrying undeniable truth, forcing James to confront the stark reality he'd attempted to evade. Lenny's conviction ignited something within James, sparking a defiant ember of resistance deep within the ashes of his disillusionment, his mentor's unyielding stance compelling him to face uncomfortable truths about the true nature of justice, truths he had tried desperately to avoid, understanding for the first time that genuine change required far greater sacrifices than he'd ever allowed himself to accept, that real victories seldom came without painful costs. Gradually, the turmoil in his heart began to resolve into clarity, the harshness of Lenny's wisdom penetrating deeply, stripping away comforting illusions until only raw honesty remained, forcing James to acknowledge the necessity of his role in this endless battle. Realizing his retreat would signify more than personal failure, it would mean abandoning those unable to defend themselves, leaving others vulnerable to the same violence he'd fought tirelessly to prevent. Though still burdened heavily by regret and loss, James felt a renewed sense of purpose rising from within, determination strengthening his battered spirit, recognizing now that the path he'd chosen would never be easy, nor free from sorrow or consequence, but understanding finally that abandoning it would betray everything he valued most, leaving injustice unchallenged and darkness unopposed. With a heart still marked by sorrow but now guided firmly by resolve, James quietly reaffirmed his commitment to continue the fight, accepting fully the harsh truth that justice demanded sacrifices he must be willing to make if he ever hoped to see genuine peace, determined never again to let fear or regret dictate his path, prepared instead to face whatever challenges awaited him, ready once more to stand unwaveringly against oppression, no matter the cost. She checked the time again, feeling the creeping anxiety coil tighter around her chest, squeezing like an invisible force slowly suffocating her. Her husband hadn't come home at his usual time, but this time, she knew, it wasn't just lateness, not an unexpected delay at work, not a forgotten errand. This was deliberate. A quiet, undeniable sign of something breaking, something slipping beyond her reach. Her pulse thudded dully in her ears as she stared at her phone, waiting, hoping, dreading. When the screen finally lit up, her breath caught in her throat. A single message. Final. I'm staying with friends. Her fingers trembled as she dropped the phone onto the table, as if it had burned her, as if those 5 words had somehow carved through the last fragile thread holding her world together. The realization settled over her like a suffocating weight, pressing against her ribs, stealing the air from her lungs. He wasn't coming home. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The silence of the apartment suddenly became unbearable, stretching wide and hollow, amplifying the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, the empty spaces where his presence used to be. Morning arrived with no relief, her body aching from a night spent tossing in restless half-sleep, eyes raw from staring at the ceiling, mind replaying every mistake, every misstep that had led to this. She forced herself up, dressed in autopilot, made her way to work like she was sleepwalking through someone else's life. The office, once familiar, now felt foreign, the hum of keyboards, the scent of coffee, the murmur of colleagues' conversations, all of it blurred together, distant, irrelevant. Nothing seemed real. Nothing seemed to matter. She answered emails, filed reports, nodded at the right moments, but inside, she was unraveling, the ground beneath her no longer solid, every task meaningless in the shadow of the quiet disaster unfolding in her life. By the time she returned home, the weight of it all settled in her bones, exhaustion layered over grief, a slow-burning agony that pulsed beneath her skin. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her gaze sweeping across the living room, over the couch where they used to sit together, the bookshelves filled with shared stories, the framed pictures on the walls, memories frozen in time, reminders of what they used to be. Everything was exactly as it had been, yet nothing was the same. She moved to the kitchen, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, but the thought of drinking it alone made her stomach twist. The sound of her phone vibrating on the counter made her flinch, hope flaring for a fleeting second before she saw the message. I can't do this anymore. Her breath left her in a sharp exhale, her vision blurring as the weight of his words crashed down, final and absolute. It was over. Not in a dramatic fight, not in an explosion of anger, but in quiet, calculated distance, in the slow disintegration of everything they had built. He was gone, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, in every way that mattered. And now, all that remained was silence. She sank onto the couch, her hands gripping the fabric, grounding herself against the overwhelming sense of loss. She wasn't sure how long she sat there before her fingers found their way to an old photo album buried beneath a stack of magazines. She hesitated before opening it, as if looking at the past would make the present hurt even more. But she couldn't stop herself. Page after page, moments captured in faded colors, Laughter, embraces, stolen glances filled with a love that once seemed unshakable. Their wedding day, his hand in hers, eyes bright with promises they thought would last forever. The vacations, the late-night dinners, the mundane snapshots of everyday life, now turned into ghosts haunting her from the pages. She traced the edges of one photograph, her fingers skimming over their smiles, and the ache in her chest deepened. She had destroyed it. Or maybe they both had. Maybe love wasn't meant to survive the weight of time, of mistakes, of unspoken words and widening spaces. The apartment felt colder, emptier, as the realization set in. There was no fixing this. No turning back. She was alone. And for the first time, she let herself feel it.